if you were to contrast your perception of China prior to moving there with the reality that you observed once you got there, what were kind of some of the major things?
Well, that's a deep question that has maybe perhaps too many answers.
Sure.
If I had to think of one specific thing, I would have to focus on the personal relationships.
Okay.
I think that from my life in America, I've always had an understanding of how to interact socially within groups where you find yourself meeting new people. We have a certain way of dealing with new people, new friends, whether it's in school or a work setting. Our interactions are almost defined or predefined in a way. And those things preclude you from behaving in certain ways, specifically around people you don't know.
Yeah.
What I found that surprised me and took some time to learn, I think it takes many people time to learn living in a new society and living in a new city, specifically in a foreign country, is that these things don't translate. So for example, like when I first started in the university, not the current university, I worked at Sichuan International Studies University in Xiaopingba. It's about 20 minutes away from the current university I'm studying at.
Okay.
The interactions that I had with my students was always fascinating to me because they treated me like their friend. There wasn't the barriers that we have, for example, in the US.
Yeah.
And it was just automatically like, oh, hey, wow, I want to learn from you. I want to talk to you all the time. And it took some time for me to realize that, okay, it's okay for me to have these kind of barriers that I'm used to, that I've taken with me from the US, but also to be willing to have conversations with my students about things like what they want to do in the future, going to different countries, my life before I became a professor or before I became a lecturer, pardon me. And it was more of a friendship. I was also their lecturer, but it was a quite fascinating thing for me because it's not something I'd ever experienced before. In the work setting, it's also much different. It's almost more personal. And I think these things can be drawn down to the differences between a homogeneous and a heterogeneous society.
Okay.
In China, everyone follows certain social and cultural norms. And those cultural norms, those social norms dictate the interactions. We are all Chinese. We all behave in this way. And that's not to say that all Chinese people are monolithic in the way they think. But there are certain things that are designed within the society for the interactions, similar to how I mentioned in the US that we have. The difference in the US is that these rules may be more defined and there may be broader barriers between new people because we don't have the same ethos, same religions, and these sorts of things. So it was quite fascinating, I think, that for me. I think that's probably one of the coolest things that I could mention is like the relationships. And again, it takes time to learn that because you generally don't have these kind of experiences in the place where you grew up because you already have predefined interaction mechanisms and normalized structures of how people know each other.
Yeah. Okay. So that's interesting. And so now that you're kind of, spending some time back in the U.S., what are some of the things that you either see in conversations or either on TV, et cetera, about China that you feel contrasts greatly with what you've seen over there and just in general? So when you interact with people back in the US who may be less traveled than yourself, how do you feel like your perspective on the world differs from theirs?
That's a good question. I think mainly it comes down to what we hear about a nation generally comes from perceptions created from afar. For example, I remember my first couple of years living in Europe. This had to be 2009, 2010. I constantly would find myself in these discussions about generalizations about the American society. Yeah. And for example, you are familiar with California. It's not the same as New York whatsoever. There are some broad generalizations you can make, but the way you live in New York is completely different from how you live in California. Our winters are completely different, So the way people behave, those mechanisms, they alter the relationships between how Californians interact with the winter and how New Yorkers do. Sure. And that's obviously a simple generalization. But my point more so goes to what people speak about with generalizations of a nation. They generally don't. There are only half truths. And I think that applies to almost every country. When you live in a society, you begin to learn the differences. For example, between New York and Mississippi, between Texas and Oklahoma,
Sure.
between Florida and Arkansas. I mean, we are all Americans here, but we have different ways of going about doing things. And I think a good example for North Carolinians and South Carolinians would be barbecue. Maybe that's an inside joke that only a handful of people will get, but these places are north and south of each other, and they argue about, what sort of style of barbecue is right and wrong. I'm not going to get into that with you. Obviously, it's not an important thing, but these kind of minute things are important. And I think with societies like China, where the language is completely different from what we learn in school about, for example, for me as a kid, French, Spanish, and German, I want to say, is that we don't have a social relationship with these things. So it's quite foreign in a way that's not foreign like Europe. And I think that creates a lot of negative impressions on people. And that's not just towards China. The same thing happens with the US. I'm sure I could give you 1,000 different examples of my experiences living in Berlin for the last 6 months during the pandemic, where people have made generalizations about the US. And generally I just ignore them because I can't argue with people about things that they've become convinced about. It really is just something that we all have to do better of, trying to educate ourselves about what is really going on in these foreign countries and why we perceive things the way we do, because it's a very complex relationship. And I think every individual of a nation doesn't think the same thing. And generally you can't conflate governments with their people. And I think these things are important for us to know. And as your question to being well-traveled, for myself, being well-traveled, one of the things I've learned is that the more you travel, the more you realize you don't know. I mean, there are places I've never been to, and I constantly hear myself thinking out loud, oh, I'd love to go to that place for this. And maybe I'll show up there, and it's nothing like what I thought it would be. And I think that's part of the magic, so to speak, of traveling, is that the more you learn, the more you understand, and that you should humble yourself to know that we can't all know everything. It's not a possibility.
Sure. So it sounds like you're attributing it a little bit more to lack of knowledge and difference in culture than you would to misinformation. Am I interpreting it correctly?
Let me think about that for a moment. Because the misinformation part is definitely a factor, especially with the way the internet functions today. A lot of people interact with information on a daily basis that just isn't true. And it becomes harder and harder to distinguish between what's real and what's not real on the internet.
Absolutely.
And having worked in IT security, I've seen things that if you don't know that it's fake before you look at it, you'd have no clue. So misinformation is definitely a factor in it. But I guess what I'd like to say I'm speaking to more so is just our ability, specifically for myself as an American and for other people who live in the US who like to find themselves being more informed about what's going on in the rest of the world, is to open your eyes to opportunities that arise. And don't just take what you hear from other people, or even from me. See for yourself. I want to say that's what I'm speaking to. Is that you kind of have to take that approach, that if you want to learn about something, you should go see it for yourself and then make your opinions, because it's hard to make to generalize or become opinionated about something based on hearsay and rumors or just general arguments that don't speak to facts.
Sure. Yeah. So I want to kind of unpack that a little bit, because I feel like occasionally misinformation potentially can complicate that, right? Because so I could apply, and again, so this is I've spent most of my life in the US. I'm not nearly as well traveled as you are. So I could try to apply this same kind of concept to North Korea, let's say, right? Where I'm like, okay, well, I don't know that much about North Korea. Let me travel there and try to experience it for myself. But from my perception, it seems like there's a reasonable possibility I don't come back. And so, so if it's simply lack of knowledge, I think it's like, okay, you can seek that knowledge on your own. But I think that when misinformation is in there as well, it can be hard to know whether or not something is a safe choice, right? So I think that some people might think that it wouldn't be safe for them to travel to China, and it sounds like, of course, from your experience, that this is likely not true. But how does one differentiate?
I can give you a great example.
Okay, yeah, let's hear it.
Okay, I can give you a great example of that, right? So I'm not going to use any specific friends of mine, but I can tell you I've had conversations with friends who are not from the U.S. who've told me they're afraid to come to America, specifically New York, because they're afraid of getting shot, or they're afraid that some type of gun violence is going to happen towards them. And statistically speaking, it's just not going to happen. I mean, you know, when you look at where gun violence happens, it's in isolated areas. I mean, let me not get too far down the rabbit hole, but you know, there are guns all across America where it's legal, for example, and also in places where they shouldn't be. I mean, New York City has laws against concealing weapons, unless you're a law enforcement professional, for example. In New York State, where I live, where my parents live, is completely different. I mean, you have completely different mechanisms for carrying weapons, but you just don't see people walking around with guns and everywhere in America, for example. And I think these kind of generalizations are problematic. And on the flip side of that, that's sort of what it's like when people say, "Oh, are you sure you want to go to China? You might lose a kidney." It's just, I have both my kidney. I have my kidneys, you know, and I've been in China for 7 years and I've never even experienced something of that nature. You know, you just hear these kinds of rumors. And again, I don't want to conflate gun violence with this sort of rumor that someone's going to steal your kidneys, because they're not the same things, obviously. But it's just an example of how, you know, we hear these kinds of things and they perpetuate false narratives. So when it comes to travel, and obviously right now during COVID, it's not the same scenario that it was a year ago, where you can't just up and travel to pretty much any country you'd like to. So to your North Korea example, I think it's, you know, it's interesting because, again, I've never been to North Korea. There are very few people I know who've been to North Korea. And when I listen to them speak about it, I'm fascinated to hear their stories and to catch their perspectives on what they think is happening in North Korea and what they think is going to happen in North Korea. And, you know, for me, I can only take what they have to say, and I can add that to my notes. And maybe if I had the opportunity to go there, I'd like to explore it. But you wouldn't hear me speaking definitively on North Korea of course, as fact, something that I'm completely unaware of or that I don't understand. And I think, obviously, I'm just a student. I'm no expert on North Korea, so perhaps that plays into it as well. But I think we have to be aware of where we are acquiring our information and what we're doing with that information once we have it within our hands.
Right, absolutely, yeah. And so it sounds like you would agree that, so I often say that you only know what you know, right? And I like the way that you said that you wouldn't speak any kind of strong fact concerning North Korea having minimal experience being there. And so it seems like kind of the what we're getting to is that there's a lack of knowledge that makes room for misinterpretation, right? So with there being no
for sure.
Prior knowledge in that area, people can fill that space with anything they want. And I think that the same is true on my end with science, right? Like there's so many claims out there, and if you don't actually have the previous information or the kind of background knowledge, it can be very easy to be swayed one way or the other. So that's interesting. That's interesting.